Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. This is a preview of the heavyweight action this weekend, a bit of a quieter weekend in terms of the big fights, but the biggest name that is returning is Daniel Dubois, and that's an interesting story in itself given what happened at his last fight out, the loss to Joe Joyce, taking a knee, the injury, the orbital bone fractures. He will be facing Bogdan Dinu. And the other fight that I'll be covering in some depth in this video is Agit Kabayel versus Kevin Johnson. So Kabayel returning for his annual fight, which is starting to become quite embarrassing for a guy who is really talented. A guy that I've had at the back of my top 15 for a few years now, but the guy is not kicking on, so we'll talk about that too. And I'll briefly mention Simon Kean, who's facing Don Haynesworth. So that fight is a little earlier than the other two, so it's at the end of the video, but it's happening on Friday in Canada. But we'll start with Daniel Dubois and Bogdan Dinu. So this is happening in the UK in a place called Telford. So Dubois returning, and actually there's some irony with he's coming back before Joe Joyce, and he's obviously had to sort of recuperate and recover after that injury sustained in that fight, a double orbital bone fracture. And also he's having a piece of the heavyweight championship, the WBA interim title, on the line. So Joe Joyce, who won that fight against Dubois, sitting, waiting, watching, Dubois comes back before him. So yeah, shame for Joyce, but it's interesting that they've decided to press for this interim heavyweight championship to be on the line, because I still think that Daniel Dubois is a young fighter that clearly still needs some more seasoning, and we saw that in the Joyce fight. Joyce, through a pretty sort of crafty game plan that had been sort of come up with by Ismail Salas, just the fundamentals. He was just circling, jabbing, and it just really was something, a code that Daniel Dubois wasn't able to crack in that one. And I think, you know, you've got the situation where the bringing him again back against Dinu, who actually I think is a better opponent than I was expecting he would come back against. I thought that he would just have some really low-level journeymen that basically were no names, that he could get some rounds and experience against come in, but clearly needs must for promoter Frank Warren, because obviously they need Dubois as one of their bigger names to be headlining cards. And so you've got this sort of situation where, you know, I kind of think his rebuild is being almost sped up because of the demands for TV that they have to have him against someone who's halfway credible, but that they can still have him headlining cards against. So there is that sort of, you know, push and pull with this whole situation, because I didn't think that we'd see him against a guy like Dinu first fight back. Not that Dinu's any great shakes, but, you know, you're trying to rebuild this guy for the long haul, right? This is what it should be about, that his career, you know, the sort of next 10 years, not the next 2 years, because he's still so young. But, you know, it is what it is. So that's all I'll say about that. But in terms of the matchup, Daniel Dubois should still win this one. Bogdan Dinu is a guy that when he stepped up, he's lost. And it is a case that sometimes when he's been hit and hurt, it does look like he fades and sort of disintegrates very quickly. So if Daniel Dubois is able to catch up with him, I think that he will look for a way out, because that's what's happened in his previous fights. Against Kubrat Pulev, he was hamming it up after he sort of got hit on the top of the head. And that was a fight that he was losing. He was doing okay in, but it was a fight that Kubrat Pulev was dictating, getting some rounds in a stay busy fight. Against Jarrell Miller, he looked pretty decent for the first round or so, or two, and then Miller decided, okay, well, I've been boxing with this guy, hasn't quite been working, and then Miller did his volume thing where he just threw a lot of punches, and Dinu couldn't handle the pressure. Eventually, it looked like, because he was dropped a few times, but it looked like some of those knockdowns were very soft. It looked like Dinu wanted a way out. And as I said when this fight was announced, I think it'll kind of go the same way. I think Bogdan Dinu, who's been talking big in Fight Week, he's been saying Daniel Dubois quit against Joe Joyce. He's, obviously doing his bit for the promotion, being the guy on the other side, saying a few things, get fans riled up, get Daniel Dubois riled up, make a good show of it. But when it comes to crunch time, I think as soon as he takes something big, it's going to be all downhill from there. Because I think for the first few rounds, he will actually look good. And I think some people underrate Bogdan Dinu's skill set. He is a big guy who's got a decent jab. He moves well. But I don't think he's got the heart to really sort of push through any adversity. Not from what I've seen of his career so far when he has stepped up to a much better level. I mean, it's all well and good blasting out cans at a lower level, but against Daniel Dubois, if he eats, a big combination, to the body and then head, because that's sort of one of Daniel Dubois' sort of signatures. Not so much in that Joyce fight, and this is one of the things I want to see him get back to, because when he punches in combination, Daniel Dubois is very, very difficult to sort of defend against. That left hook to the body and then the right hand upstairs. And when he does go 2, 3, 4 punches in combination, he looks very good. We saw a lot of one-off stuff against Joe Joyce. He went away from the body work too in particular, which I think a lot of people ahead of the Joyce fight were like, well, Joyce was hurt to the body by Bryant Jennings. Dubois should be investing to the body. So I guess that's one of the things with the new trainer, Shane McGuigan. What's he going to add? So they've linked up recently. It was actually Mark Tibbs before that. They didn't even have the fight together. He moved on to Shane McGuigan. So, yeah, obviously the rumour mill has been saying that Daniel Dubois' father, who has an influence over him, was part of that shift. I don't know that for a fact. That is just what a lot of people have been saying and what some people have been alluding to in interviews. But so he's moved on from his previous trainer, Martin Bowers, who trained him for all his pro career until this fight. And it's going to be McGuigan stepping into the breach. So it'll be interesting to see what he can do with him. I mean, I guess for this first fight, they only really linked up a few weeks ago. It's probably going to be the Daniel Dubois that we all know and are used to. I'm not expecting any drastic changes. But if he can move his head a bit more, and if he can get back to sort of body punching in combination, I think that's going to be a good start. And for a guy like Bogdan Dinu, I think he will be able to, maybe not first round or two, because I think Dinu will be a bit elusive, but eventually he's going to catch up with him. And I think it will be, something to the body, a combination that really starts to open him up, and then it'll be all downhill from there. And I expect he will have this WBA interim championship belt around his waist at the end of the night. It'd be a massive shock if he lost to Dinu. Not because, Dinu is the greatest shakes in the world, but it would have to be something similar, like he'd get injured or something like that. I don't see Bogdan Dinu stopping Daniel Dubois, knocking him out, but, I guess stranger things have happened. But Daniel Dubois to win this one inside half a dozen rounds, probably earlier, but I'll just sort of throw that out there, because Dinu, if he makes it tricky and awkward by moving, he can last a bit. We saw against Kubrat Pulev was not going to the body at all, where Dinu was open to. He just seemed to be content to sort of let it sort of drag on a bit for longer than it probably should have. Anyway, we'll get to the Kabayel and Johnson fight, and it's kind of like the Dubois fight in a sense that it's one of these fights that we're not necessarily terribly looking forward to, and probably almost forgot was happening this week. I got to say, both these fights snuck up on me, and I think that's because I'm just not sort of that enamored with them. Agit Kabayel, I just have no idea what he's doing with his career. And I actually, on a piece on Patreon a couple of weeks ago, when this fight was confirmed, I was like, what is this guy doing? He's fading into oblivion. There was the Derek Chisora win in 2017, which, I think has aged really well too, given that Chisora has given a lot of guys very good fights since then. But Kabayel has just not pushed on. Some of the opposition has been okay, but he's just been too inactive. And now we're dropping down to the Kevin Johnsons of the world. He should have been fighting him like 5 or 6 years ago, not in 2021. And I get that SES Boxing, who promotes Kabayel, they also had a fight with Juan Pablo Hernandez, who came back last year. Johnson, against the grain, upset him, and perhaps they owed Johnson a fight, and they had to give him a certain amount of money or whatever, and they just have to get this off the books. Maybe this is why this has been made. But Kabayel talks in different interviews and bits and pieces that he wants to be the heavyweight champion of the world. Well, you're going to have to start actually proving that you want to go that route instead of facing, faded journeyman 41-year-old Kevin Johnson, or 42 perhaps now. I mean, it's just not good enough. He should be actually utilizing this co-promotional deal with Top Rank. I have no idea why he is still in Germany fighting the likes of Kevin Johnson. And I guess some people will say, hey, well, what about the pandemic? People can't travel. Well, that is not true. We've seen a lot of people traveling for fights to the United States or other places. I mean, Josh Taylor just had his undisputed fight in Las Vegas. There is not the barriers that maybe there were in the early part of the pandemic. We are approaching a new normal. And, guys like Kabayel and Tony Yoka, who've linked up with Top Rank on co-promotional deals, they really should be getting into the United States and building their profile, having some more meaningful fights than the likes of a faded husk like Kevin Johnson. Johnson was a good fighter about 10, 15 years ago, but that's 10, 15 years ago. We've mostly seen Johnson as a journeyman wheeled out against prospects in recent years. And Kabayel's not a prospect anymore. That sort of phase has come and gone. You've got 20 fights on the books now, and you're still facing a Kevin Johnson. It's embarrassing. I get in 2020 having a fight against Evgenius Lazaridis. Like, that was a situation, lockdown coming back. It was, maybe a bit below where people wanted to see him. But then you drop down further to Johnson, and you're talking this fight up as a big fight, a real challenge. I mean, whether he really believes that or not, I mean, who knows? But this is embarrassing. The guy has a lot of talent. He's sort of fringe world level, just not being stepped up. And you have to ask the reason why. And he does have, by the look of it, a pretty sweet endorsement deal with Puma. He's featured in campaigns with the likes of Lewis Hamilton. So I'm wondering, while there seems to be maybe fewer opportunities than he or his promoters would like, if they are just sort of milking the sort of money that he's making elsewhere. That could totally factor into it. That's just an assumption by me. But in terms of this fight and how it's going to play out, well, Agit Kabayel, who's not a massive puncher, but he's a good boxer. He moves well. He's got decent power. He's a good body puncher, does the fundamentals well. He's probably just going to, rack up a comfortable win. I'm not expecting him to necessarily stop Johnson because we know Johnson is tough. He hasn't been stopped that often. But as soon as Kabayel starts to unload on him, and really starts to pot shot and pick him off, what Johnson will do is probably just go into a shell, as we've seen him so many times against decent prospects. He'll go the rounds, he'll be a sort of a tough sort of cookie to crack, and it'll be a decision. That's what I'm expecting, because Johnson will start to, after a few rounds, if he doesn't fancy it, just be negative. And it's hard to sort of, stop a guy who is being ultra negative, as Kevin Johnson can often be. There were points in the past couple of years where I've sort of said in videos, I don't want to see Kevin Johnson anymore. One, there's diminishing returns about how much credit you can get against him, but also it starts to be like 10 rounds of the same thing round after round, where he's being, really uber negative, and the guy in front of him is just sort of, not able to get through and really sort of making any dents into him. Yeah, so not a great fight, and who knows what they're really doing with him, what the plans are, because it's not clear to the rest of us. 4 fights in the past 4 years, I mean, it's not good enough for Kabayel. So they need to really actually, if they're going to do anything with him, because he's not getting any younger, the guy's like about 30 now, so they need to actually do something with him. Anyway, going on to Simon Kean. So he will be facing Don Haynesworth. That's going to be on punchinggrace.com, subscription service out of Canada. Kean has been rather inactive because of the pandemic. Haynesworth is just a flat-out journeyman. He's fought the likes of, say, Zhang Jilei, all that sort of stuff. I mean, he will give it a go, but if Kean is good enough, he should stop him. And I don't think that Kean has been the same since he was stopped a couple of years ago. And ultimately, he came back and he did avenge that loss to Dylan Carmen. But he's sort of fighting like a guy that, doesn't quite know what he wants to do. He's a bit, sort of gun shy in terms of pulling the trigger there. So there's been fights like the Ljakovic one where you're just like, man, he looks dreadful. It's and he should have been battering him. Ultimately, he got the win in the end, but it just feels like, he's a guy that once he steps up to any real level, if he still is, got the after effects after that loss of having been knocked out, that he could be stopped again. Anyway, what do you make of it? I think Dubois, Kabayel, and Kean to win. Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe. Follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.